Hello, everyone. Welcome. Sorry, I lost track of time. It's 6:02. Sorry about that. My name is Kelly Justice, and I am I don't know. We don't talk about. I am the current captain of Fountain Bookstore, and you are sailing with us tonight in our history night with our author, Ric Murphy, and we're very excited to have him. I want to get through a couple of announcements first. Number one, you can buy Ric's book right down here if you see, or actually it might be there depending on what kind of device you're looking from at any point during the event tonight. It won't take you away from the event at all. You'll just pop up on another screen, and if you're moved at any time to buy the book, there's a link to the website there. If you're joining us from Facebook, hi. It's great. It's great to see you, except that we can't see you. You can see us, but we can't see you. If you ask questions in the chat and in the live, we won't be able to see them. This is a Crowdcast event, and the Crowdcast link is in the Facebook Live listing. So if you want to ask questions, please hop on to Crowdcast and join us over here. We do have another history night planned for the end of next month. There's another night of local history on the very last day of the month in September, on the 30th. This is on the last day of August. This wasn't done intentionally, but now you've got something that's easy to remember, and maybe we'll start a tradition. I don't know. Without further ado, let's welcome. I'm so thrilled to see a nice group for this event. It's wonderful. And we're going to bring Ric Murphy on here. Here we go. I did not mention his CV, where he is a graduate of I have also lost your bio. Hang on just a second. There it is.
Nobody wants to hear that. Hi, Kelly.
A bachelor's degree from Boston, a bachelor's degree from University of Massachusetts. But tonight we'll be talking about Virginia history and African history. And I'm very interested in this. I'm going to put up a little poll that I didn't tell you about ahead of time. Sorry, Ric. Welcome. I'm going to put up a poll, and I'm going to ask the audience if they have ever. You can tell us a little bit about this group of Africans that came here, and I'm going to ask the audience if they've ever heard of them, because I had not. This was not a piece of history I knew about. Would you like to tell us about this group?
Well, Kelly, first of all, thank you very much for having me this evening. I'm sitting in my office and I can see the rain coming down. So I also see a lot of guests who are on your show this evening. So I would like to think it's because I'm interesting, but I think it's because it's raining and they have nothing else to do and they're a little tired of the news. So they want to have a change of pace. So hopefully the next couple of minutes will give them a change of pace. These Africans are very interesting, unique, and I'm glad you started off with this as something you did not learn in school, because I don't think any of us learned about this in school. And I think all the challenges that we're having these days, it's kind of refreshing that we take a new look at American history, a new look at who we are as Americans of African descent, but more important, how did some of us get here? Do we know where we came from? Do we know what ships we arrived on? And more important, how is that history important to us today and going forward? Mm-hmm. And that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book that I did. And I know you've got it there on your screen, but I'll give a little plug out. And the reason for that is the book is supposed to come out today or tomorrow, so folks can begin to buy it online. Let me share with you, and I see a lot of the guests of folks that I know, and those who don't know. I started my genealogical journey back in the mid-1970s, and although I'm not that old, it appears that I am getting that old. And when I started my genealogical journey, I had no idea about the rich history of my family, where they came from, other than my northern roots. And as I began to go further and further south, I began to follow a lot of the legal documents that helped me trace my lineage. which brought me to the first Angolans that arrived in the 1600s, in fact, 1619. When I found that history out, I began to explore deeper and deeper as to who these men, women, and children were, because to me, that was the real story. It wasn't just my knowing that I descended from them. I really wanted to know a lot more about them. I think my genealogical journey, I hit what most people hit, was the brick wall in terms of who they were, how they came here, and where they came from. But in 1997, a Danish researcher by the name of Engel Sluter found a treasure trove of documents in the Spanish archives. He wasn't looking for them, he fell upon them. And I think all of our ancestors, those of us who are American, who have African ancestry, they must have been reaching out to him to find this treasure trove. They must have been waiting for someone to dust off those dusty records and said, hey, you better spend some time in looking at this. And when he did, he began to realize that the documents he held in his hand were very important to a whole bunch of people, because they provided a roadmap in terms of the Africans that were kidnapped by the Portuguese in late 1618 and 1619, when the Portuguese found silver under the royal capital city of Kabasa, Angola. They sent 36 ships to Angola to take over the land, and the last ship to arrive was called the San Juan Bautista. And because it was the last ship to arrive, it was at the port. And what the Portuguese did with some African mercenaries is they went in and they took out the royals first, because whenever you topple a government, you take out the head of the government. And that's what they did. Now, what's interesting about that is the following year, John Thornton also wrote an article about who these people were. So it's not just they were the first to leave, but he gave insight that many of these Angolans, although they were top of the government, many of the sons were educated in Europe for the past 200 to 300 years. He provided documentation in terms of a lot of these sons of the royals were educated in Spain. They were educated in Portugal. Many of the clergy were actually educated in Rome, and some were actually educated in England, which gave a clue that many of them were bilingual, and not bilingual just in terms of native language, but also bilingual in terms of European language. When these Africans were kidnapped, there was the actual register of the San Juan Bautista when it left Angola. It had 350 Africans on it. So we're starting a trail of documentation in Rome, Spain, and Portugal. When those Africans left Angola, they stopped in Jamaica. So there are now legal records in Jamaica in terms of how they left 24 young boys. The Angolans, when they were taken from Africa, Angola, they were enslaved. When they were put on the San Juan Bautista, they were enslaved. And if they were to arrive at their final port of call, which was Veracruz, New Spain, which is now present-day Mexico, they would have gotten off those ships as enslaved Angolans. But something happened in the meantime, and that Spanish ship, the San Juan Bautista, according to this rich treasure trove of documentation, the ship was pirated by two English ships, the White Lion and the Treasurer. So that documentation is now found in England, Bermuda, Jamaica, as well as in Mexico and the colony of Virginia. So you can begin to see the documentation that begins to come together to weave together a very complex puzzle. I found that so interesting that I knew at some point in time I had to write this down in a book. Now, there have been other books that have touched upon this, but I wanted to deal specifically with the journey from Angola to Jamaica to the Bay of Comanche, where these Angolans were kidnapped 500 miles off the coast of New Spain, present-day Mexico, and their journey to the Virginia colony. So that's what this book covers. Now, why is that important? Well, some believe that 75% of present-day Americans of African descent, whether you are Black or white with African DNA, descend from those very early Angolans that came here. Now, there were 3 ships that came here in the early 1600s. One was the White Lion that we believe 30 came off the ship. There was the Treasurer. Between 1 and 3 came off that ship, and it went to Bermuda. And another ship that arrived in 1628, which was the Fortune. And those Angolans also came from the same area, Angola. So 75% of modern day Americans of African descent descend from those individuals, which means that at least one of your ancestors comes from these group of men, women, and children who came on those 3 ships. I felt that was important to tell that story. Now, I've got other books in my head that will be coming out to explain more detail, but I thought that piece of American history needs to be told. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that's important, as a former teacher, principal, assistant superintendent, and a member of the superintendent's staff of the city of Boston, I know that we lose our young Black boys in school in the 4th grade. And if we don't lose them in the 4th grade, we lose them in the 7th grade. Now, it's either 4th through 5th or 7th through 8th, depending on the state curriculum. But those are the years you start to teach slavery. And in teaching slavery, these young boys, when they see Black men in chains, psychologically stays with them for the remainder of their lives. And I felt it was very important that we begin to change the national narrative that the Angolans who came here were as smart, if not smarter, than the English peasants who were the day-to-day laborers in the Virginia colony. So that's important to understand, because I think if I was a young boy and knew that my ancestors here were as smart, if not smarter, than the population as a whole, I probably would have looked at history differently. The teachers would have taught it differently. And I think it's about time we change the national narrative, a false narrative, in terms of who our ancestors were. Now, this by no stretch is to change the narrative of enslaved Africans in the colonies at any point in time. But I think it begins to change a national narrative in terms of who we are. Now, just a little side story here. I remember distinctly when I was in school, when slavery was taught. In my classroom, which was also in the 4th grade, we sat in alphabetical order. So I probably sat in the 3rd row in the back. And when the subject of slavery came up, I distinctly remember, because everyone in my classroom turned around to look at me, because I was the only Black student in my middle class suburban classroom. And when they turned to look at me, I turned around to see who they were looking at behind me. So I remember that moment, and I think most Black men do remember when they start talking about slavery, because there's an uneasiness that comes about. So I think it was important to write a book that changed the national narrative so that we as Americans of African descent can begin to teach our own children about slavery in a different methodology than what was taught in the past. Because our enslaved ancestors built the country. Our economy was based on enslaved labor. The westward bound was built on enslaved labor, and that's what the Civil War was about, westward migration. So I hope in some small way I've changed the narrative, even if it's an inch or a millisecond, then that's what I felt it was important that I do.
So you're talking about
long answer to a short question.
One of the things we wanted to touch on tonight was you've made a career out of documenting the contributions of Americans of African descent to history, and the fact that this is not taught in schools is just insane to me. But because it gives a really unbalanced view of American history, and it's
absolutely.
Now, you did say there is. I'm often impressed by how heated some of our history nights get and the store when we're there. Historians and people who love history were very passionate about their opinions. And he said that there's been some controversy about this, the dating
1619.
1619 compared to some other things as far as people arriving in Virginia. People of African descent arriving in Virginia. And what was that? What is that controversy that's been mentioned?
Well, there's a lot of different threads of controversy, and depends on how you look at it. I mean, one controversy is, I'll hear all the time, how do you know this? How do you know where they came from? How do you know they could read or write? How do you know they spoke multiple languages? If you're talking the 1600s, it's virtually impossible for anyone to know this. And unfortunately, that's the way we were taught in schools, that any African who came here only spoke with 4 syllables. Mm-hmm. And we know that because we all grew up with Tarzan, and that's what we saw on TV. Unfortunately, there is just so much documentation over all of these different continents about these single group of 60 Angolans that people just can't believe it. Now, there's other threads to this. 1619 Project, which is a project out of New York, the New York Times, Hannah Nicole Jones. She's taken a different spin on this. She's talked about how African-American history really starts around the Revolutionary War, and how our nation was founded on certain principles, and this controversy around that. And I think, quite frankly, the more controversy there is, the better the dialogue, because we're forcing people to begin to address a false narrative that they didn't want to address before. Mm-hmm. So when I'm on shows like these, I don't run away from the controversy. I want to run head into the controversy, because it's important to me, and it's important to my descendants and nieces and nephews and everybody else, that we begin to get this right. We can no longer put our heads in the sand like an ostrich, like the narrative that we learned is correct, because it isn't. And I want to applaud, and I shouldn't be doing this here, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to applaud the governor of Virginia, because it was just announced today that their Department of Education, where the history has been Confederate based, and that's the history that was taught in the Virginia public schools, is now going to change, and is going to be more balanced to encompass the history of Americans of African descent, because that's important. It's got to start. And I want every governor in the country to do the same thing, to follow his leadership, because it's important that we begin to change this dialogue. Now, one of the things, Kelly, I want to talk about is, I can't believe that all of this documentation has been in these archives and in the libraries, and for 400 years, a narrative has been perpetuated when people knew this documentation was out there. So it shouldn't be me coming forward in a book with 2020 and some of the other folks coming forward with this stuff. The greater question is, why wasn't this stuff released beforehand? Because people knew it was a false narrative. So the time has come for all of these folks to come forward. If you've got something in your library that corrects the false narrative, don't sit on it. If you've got deeds and wills that talk about people as free people, come forward. Now, I go to meetings with historians, and they say, well, these Africans were enslaved. I says, well, how do you know that? I like to toy with them. How do you know that? What's your proof? Right. Well, did you look at this document that it clearly says his name and he was a servant? Well, they knew the difference between servant and slavery. Well, if they did, then they knew when they wrote down that the person was a servant and not a slave, that he or she wasn't a slave. So if those records were there in the 1600s, and they should know better than I or anyone else the legal status of those people, and that's what they put in those documents, then how are we now to come forward and say they were enslaved? And one other thing, Kelly, while I'm on a roll here, what's really important is these men and women were so sophisticated They wound up owning substantial tracts of land as found in the colonial records. And then if you look at the 1705 slave codes, did you know that those slave codes, if you take a piece of paper and all the accomplishments of those well-learned Angolans and put them on a list of 1 to 85, and 1705, they turned them all around, and that became the slave codes, which became the foundation of antebellum slavery and the Jim Crow laws after Reconstruction that many of us still suffer under today.
They were trying to cover, when they wrote
Absolutely.
they were trying to cover things that they already saw.
Absolutely.
Right. It makes perfect sense. We've got some questions in the audience we'll get to in just a moment, but I did want to, I'll put up a little poll because folks, someone in the audience had asked how many people are there. It was James, actually, who's a big fan of yours.
Hi, James.
And so I am. So we're going to add a poll. He asked how many people here in the group are descendants of the first group of Africans, if you know. And so there's a poll. And you can take that now, and we'll look at the results in just a moment. It is true. The curriculum has to change. When I was growing up, and I've been around for a little while, but when I was growing up, we had the same American history. I remember this vividly. We had the same American history segment every year, repeated every single year. There was something called the Revolutionary War. We spent about a month on that. And then we would spend, this is in Southwestern Virginia. And then we would spend 4 months on the Civil War, and then there was some guy named Kennedy, and a week on World War II, and I think that was about it. And it was a disproportionate amount of coverage, and from a very particular perspective, and to see that change for future children would be remarkable, and absolutely necessary.
Absolutely.
Why? So these folks, we want to talk about how this relates to current events, and then I want to open it up to questions. That's what we'll do next. So let's talk about how this relates to Black Lives Matter and the current climate we find ourselves in right now, and all the important things that are happening.
Well, one of the things I talk about, up until a year ago, there are textbooks in the Virginia public schools. And sometimes I show it up on the screen if I go to a public talk or something, where they talk about, and particularly if I go to those communities that they have those books, that the slaves in Virginia were happy with their masters because their masters were so good to them, or that they had such a great relationship with them because the masters took care of them. There are these very condescending terms in books today. So not going back 25, 50, 100 years ago, books that are going on today. So there's a perception that the institution of slavery was a good one. Oftentimes I will get emails from angry people or whatever the case may be. And why is this coming up now? Things were going along so well before, and these protests, protesters who are out in the street, why are they complaining? Why are they angry now? Things were just going along peachy dandy. And I always respond back to them, maybe you weren't listening. Mm-hmm. Maybe you didn't hear. These protests have been going on since 1667, Bacon's Rebellion, when a multiracial group of people were so angry with the oligarchs in Virginia that they burned the capital city of Jamestown. Mm-hmm. That's quite a few years ago. So it's not just these protests today saying it's time for you to listen to my pain and my agony. Mm-hmm. You had different rebellions. You had the Nat Turner Rebellion. Certainly the Civil War was about slavery. Certainly the protests that took place. Now, what's very interesting, and let's talk about the military. When Black soldiers went to fight during the Revolutionary War, They believed in liberty. They believed in equality. They believed what the founding fathers were saying, and they went to war with England for the independence of the 13 colonies. But when the war was over, they were not treated equally.
That's right.
And many of them protested. The War of 1812, they knew the English was going to come back. Many African men became naval men, sailors, and after the War of 1812, they came back, and again, they were not treated equally, and they protested. During the American Civil War, 200,000 African men went to fight the Civil War to free other Americans of African descent, and after the Civil War, they were not treated equally. World War I, the Spanish-American War, my ancestor was in the Spanish-American War, went overseas and was in Cuba, and when he came back, was almost lynched, was not treated equally. World War I, they went to a foreign soil to free foreigners from tyranny and fascism and everything else, and came back to the segregated South, and no different than World War II in Vietnam. So why this is important today is, for some reason, there are those who believe that this is something that's coming up for the first time. I thought it was very interesting when one of the coaches says, "We love America, but America has not shown its love for us." So this is an important dialogue that we now need to say, okay, the time has come, it needs to stop. So its importance today is we're seeing these young men and women go to the streets and say enough is enough. And what's interesting is I get a lot of emails and they'll say, well, why do you think these young white kids are taking to the street? And for me, it's a very easy answer. Anyone under 30 years of age, a third of their entire life, 50% of their adult life was under a Black president, where they saw competence, they saw intelligence, they saw integrity. So they don't see us as something different, because that picture of the Black president hung in their classrooms as elementary, middle, and high school kids, and they see us different. They don't see us as the perception of what they heard either at home or in school. So it's important that we as adults, their elders, now we take their lead and say it's time for us to make a change. So this book is all about how do we change a false narrative, how do we correct a narrative, and how do we take our rightful place in society, because we love this country, because this country is our country. Our ancestors have been here before most came over in the ships in the 1800s and early 1900s. This is our home. We are technically the second indigenous people behind the first Americans who were born here going back 20,000 years. We're the second indigenous people. This is our country. And it's important that others begin to recognize that, accept that we're here, we're to stay, and we're going to correct the narrative.
That's right. As we have one person in the I'm sorry, I'm turning my phone to airplane mode because bad things have happened in other events. One of the people in our chat is saying, can we please hold questions so we can hear from more from the author? So
I'd rather hear the questions.
Kathy, we appreciate
I can go on a roll, Kelly, and I don't think you want me to do that. So.
I know, that's so funny. But please, it is question and answer time. There is an ask a question button where you can ask in the chat. And I'm gonna turn some of the comments into chat. You can also put them in the comments. I'll turn them into questions. So William says, thank you for the discussion. Do you have any opinions on Bacon's Rebellion as a turning point for the history of slavery in the United States?
And I'm sorry, who asked the question?
William.
William, how you doing? William, don't ever ask me my opinion. I got one for you. Yeah, I think Bacon's Rebellion was really interesting, and I studied it. On the frontier, what you had was a multiracial class of people. White men married black women, Native American women. Black men married white women, Native American women. It was so multiracial that they had to actually create a law and say no more interracial marriage. They went a step further and they told the ministers, anyone who marries an interracial couple will be fined heavily. When these interracial people got tired of the treatment by the oligarchs, they rebelled. That was a pivotal moment in American history, because when the battle was over, when the insurrection was over, the rebellion was over, those oligarchs began to put laws in place, divide and conquer. And the laws were written so for the poor white peasants, they wanted them to know that you are better than these multiracial people and these Africans who are now coming over. And that was the beginning of divide and conquer. And poor white peasant, no matter how poor and no matter how much of a peasant you are, and whether you could read or write, you are still better than those who could read and write and own land. So that was a very pivotal moment. So those of you who've not read about Bacon's Rebellion, it's an eye-opener in terms of what happened and how it happened. And what made it worse is Nathaniel Bacon died, and upon his death, within weeks, the insurrection was halted. But those who continued the fight were the multiracial and the Americans of African descent. And when it was squashed, the whites were let free and they were hung. So that's a clear indication of how Bacon's Rebellion changed the whole dialogue. And from that point forward, they enacted laws specifically to put the blacks in their place and to make sure that their descendants would not be able to reap the benefits of what happened before. So that's a good question, William. Bacon's Rebellion got a lot of opinions on that. And I hope I live long enough to write a book just on Bacon's Rebellion.
Thank you for that. William says, absolutely fascinating. Thank you, he says. So Barbara has asked, what do you see is the greatest risk? I'm going to rephrase that a little bit and tell me if I'm wrong, Barbara. What do you see as the greatest risk to the Black Lives Matter movement, which she wholeheartedly supports as an ally? And I believe maybe she means threat, the greatest threat to the Black Lives Matter movement. That might be, I think, the question.
Well,
threat. She says yes, threat.
Yeah, as a historian, let me put in a little historical context. My grandfather attended the March on Washington. I'm originally from Boston. They drove down in a couple of school buses from Boston. They came to Washington to listen to Martin Luther King's speech. That was a powerful speech. And when my grandfather came back, he pulled all of his grandchildren together, I guess the full 14, 15 of us who were alive at the time, and made sure we understood the importance of that march. But what's also interesting, as we now understand, that it was infiltrated by the FBI and other federal agencies to weaken the organization and to try to portray people differently than what they were and who they are at the time. My concern about the Black Lives Movement is I embrace the multiracial aspect of Black Lives Matter. I embrace it. I think it's important that it's not just a Black movement, that it's a multiracial movement. My concern is those who infiltrate it or use it for their own means other than the intent of what those peaceful protesters are doing. I was concerned when I saw the Umbrella Boys breaking windows, knowing that it would incite reaction from the police. They went into the poorest neighborhoods. So those who were unfortunate went in to steal and loot. So I'm concerned of the infiltration. And I think those of us who are concerned need to speak out. I'm concerned for those who try to use this for their benefit, and I won't talk politics. So I'm concerned how people will turn this movement into something that it's not supposed to be. I think we need to keep our eyes focused to make sure that we don't allow that happen. And when it does, I think we should speak out. I think Black Lives is important. I think its message is important. I think our young people are beginning to understand that they are somebody, that they are as important as anybody else. I get it, all lives matter, but that's the main objective of Black Lives Matter. Don't treat me less. Don't say everyone's life matter, but mine. So that's why Black Lives matter, and that's what my biggest concern is. I think that's the threat, that there are those who are infiltrating it, whose hearts are not where it should be. Their motives are not where we want them to be. And I think it's going to become a political ploy over the next 5, 6, or 8, 10 weeks or days or whatever the case may be, to try to show it to be something other than what it is. That's my fear.
Right. That and there's the people who will use it as a use the movement as a cover to do things that
Correct.
as a
Correct.
A shield to do things that are not in the spirit of the movement.
Yes.
Period. And that gives me a good time to put in a link to our latest PDF of our Black Voices newsletter, which is just come out. If you can't get a hold of a paper copy at this, when you place an order online, they will come in your shipments. But if you just want to read it, we make it available to everybody. So next question is from, thank you, Barbara. James has asked, do you have any idea how much of this history is known by the current government of Angola? And have you ever reached out to their embassy? What a great question.
Excellent question, James. That's I don't know if it's the same James or a different James.
Yeah, it's the same James.
Yes, they are very much aware of it. I've had a number of meetings with them. They have been most gracious. In fact, they had an event, I think it was this past November. The embassy brought together a number of historians. In fact, Hannah Jones was there. Hannah Nicole Jones was there. And they embraced us. They embraced the history. They didn't really know as much as we did or as much as I knew, but they do now. In fact, I'm the national vice president of the Afro-American Historical Genealogical Society. And prior to COVID-19, they were going to have a special workshop, and they were going to be a sponsor of the conference because they felt it was very important that Angola be represented at the conference. In fact, we had, I think, 9 or 10 different foreign delegations that were going to be part of the conference. So they're aware of it, they're embracing it, and they're looking to us to help them build out the narrative going forward. So James, if you know of folks from Angola, if you got those contacts, certainly talk to them. Unfortunately, as we all know, staff change in embassies. It's hard reaching them right now. So I truly and hopefully believe that they will still be there. And after COVID-19 is over with, we can begin to build those bridges and take this to the next level. Thank you, James.
And Gerald in the audience is hoping, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, that they'll be part of the next conference.
Absolutely.
And this question from Bob. Bob is a wonderful author, and he's also in the audience. I had his book laying around here, and I don't have it to show on screen, but I'm sure Bob wouldn't want the attention. So he's asking how historians and writers and authors can help tell a richer, more faithful story of American history that embodies and even helps to center the essential contributions and remarkable achievements that enslaved and non-enslaved people made to this country. from its beginnings so that we see those achievements as central to the American story. And he says, thank you, sir. Bob is also a journalist.
Bob, I think that's a phenomenal question. I think step number one is don't look at us separate from the narrative. We were part of the narrative. There's absolutely no part of American history that did not have an African-American presence. So I think the first thing is for journalists and historians or novelists or anybody who writes, begin to realize that we are not a sidebar discussion. We were at the table. There is no battle. There is no war. There is no period in history where Americans of African descent were not a vital component of that history. And what's happened is we were written out of the narrative, not included in the narrative. So I think that's really what needs to happen. And so many times we see Americans of African descent is what you see on the first 3 minutes of your evening news and feel that that's not part of the narrative without realizing that we are the narrative. So good question, Bob. Thank you.
And a somewhat personal question, I think it'd be all right, from Calvin. He would like more details on what you found about your ancestral line to 1619.
Thank you, Calvin. Part of my research, I found out that I descend from at least 2 of those men, women, and children that were on that San Juan Bautista. My 5th great grandmother was Harriet Gowen. And John Gowen was one of the first Angolans to arrive. He married a woman by the name of Margaret Cornish. So I descend directly from John Gowen and Margaret Cornish. And at the AUGS conference in October, we're going to provide a rich discussion on John Gowen and his descendants, John Gowen and Margaret Cornish and their descendants. So believe it or not, I descend from them. And what I've come to learn in my genealogical research, that I descend from a number of very important and famous Americans of African descent, whether those that first arrived in 1619 or those that served in the revolution. I descend from 13 men who fought in the American Revolutionary War. I descend from Civil War soldiers, World War II, so I don't know how, although I'm a mutt of many nations, I seem to be a mutt that have very important ancestors who fought in battles. I come from a long military history, which I had no idea. And many of them were actual heroes based on the National Archives and the documentation that comes forward. So Thank you, Calvin, for the question. But I do descend from those very first Angolans that arrived in 1619 from the San Juan Bautista from Kabasa, Angola.
I have a follow-up to that. How can people find out about that conference? Is it open to anyone? My ears perked up when you mentioned the conference.
It's open to everyone.
Okay.
If you go to www, A as in Apple, H as in Henry, G as in George, S as in Sam, aahgs.org, www.augs.org. Look for the conference tab. You can scroll down. The conference is October 14th through 17th. It's a virtual conference. We have dramatically reduced the rate for those who attend. So we certainly encourage everyone to attend. We have some phenomenal speakers. Hopefully some of those speakers are on the line today. We also will have a virtual expo hall. So if you've got families, histories that you'd like to share, please join our expo hall. It's only $100 if someone wants to share their family history to become part of the expo hall. So we look forward to everyone participating. Join us. And on Friday morning, I and 2 or 3 other people are going to be talking about John Gowen and Margaret Cornish's descendants. We've got the Cumbo family that's going to come forward with 2 descendants, Andre Kearns, and others are going to be talking about that. So we got a lot of stuff. We have some folks who are going to be doing presentations on how they were able to track Virginia enslaved people. and they're arriving in Louisiana, Louisiana 16. So we got a lot of rich history that we're going to talk about. And I think for those of you who aren't familiar with this, I think you're going to be shocked what you're going to hear and see. So again, aahgs.org.
Yes, we've put that in the chat for people to refer to, and when we do the email follow-up to this, I will include that link there as well.
Thank you,
we do have one of the speakers. Is there Renata? I believe is that.
Yeah, she's one of the speakers. Yes, phenomenal presentation she's going to have.
You know, having with everything converting to online, we had Independent Bookstore Day this weekend online from our show. Well, I was in this room, but I don't dismiss these events that are happening online because they are turning into really vibrant. Ours, we broke out into sessions where people could talk together. There was a wonderful expo as well where we had booths for information, and we had a blast. I mean, we had a blast all day, and there was just so much to do and so much to there's people doing wonderful things, and this sounds like a really great opportunity for people to join this. And I'm going to ask the final couple of questions. Here's an easy one. What were the name of the 3 ships you mentioned again? That's Gerald, and I can't remember them either. So.
Gerald, it was the San Juan Bautista and the Fortune. Those were the 2 major ships, but there was also the White Lion and the Treasurer, and those were the 2 ships that pirated the San Juan Bautista. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, Kelly, those of you who are not familiar with the Voyagers database, certainly look up the Voyagers database, because Emory University did a phenomenal research project where every single ship from the 1500s to the 1800s that left Africa with human cargo, no matter where in the world it went to, you can trace those ships, the number of Africans that were on the ships, the ports of call, whether it was South America, Central America, North America, England, no matter where they went, and you can probably figure out by your DNA and the time of your DNA what ships your ancestors came on. So go to the Voyagers database. I think it's voyagersdatabase.org, but I could be wrong. But if you look it up, you'll find it.
William is helping us out in the chat. Maybe he can.
Okay, thank you, William.
That. Let's see, and we'll do a last question and round it up here. And this is also from James tonight. He wants to know if you could talk a little bit about the first African women who came over, as well as the first generations, how the first generations adapted to their new home in America.
Well, you know, James, it's very interesting. The colonial records were not kind to the Angolan women. And what I mean by that, the Angolan men, because it was a patriarchal society, it's easier to find their names. When they all came here in the 1620 census, they were all unnamed. In the 1623 census, most of the men were named, but only a few of the women. As they married, that's how we began to find their identities through marriage. So it's not as easy to track the women as it did the men. In addition to that, we only know about the women if some legal event took place that put them in the colonial records. The children of the Angolan men and the Angolan women.
A legal event would be, can you give some examples of a legal event? Like, I guess a marriage or a contract?
Head rights. And I'll kind of quickly, for every head you brought from England to the colony, you were entitled to 50 acres of land. And what happened was they began to list the women as head rights. So you find them in the land documents with their names. Now, oftentimes they didn't have their last name unless the head right was 2 head rights for the Angolan husband and his Angolan wife. So that's what I meant by legal records. You begin to find them. There were instances where the Angolan men may have divorced their wives, so you'll find their names in the records. But you primarily find the names of the wives in the land records because they were used as servants, not slaves, as servants, as head rights. And then when you begin to trace them, you can begin to find them that way. Now to their children. The first generation did exceptionally well. The first generation of Angolans actually did better than the poor whites that came from England. And we know that based on the land that they owned. But as the colony began to change the laws, their descendants began to lose the rights that their ancestors had, and you can begin to see how they were treated differently. For example, Anthony Johnson and his wife Mary, and her name was in the legal land documents, owned close to 2,000 acres of land. The land he owned in Virginia, upon his death, he willed it to his son Richard. And the county said that Richard was not able to inherit his father's land and wealth because Anthony was an illegal alien. And because he was an illegal alien, that denied Richard the opportunity to inherit his father's land. Now, what I find interesting is when you look at who was on the jury, those white jurymen all were born in England, and they were illegal aliens as well by their own definition, but they're the ones that inherited or stole Anthony's land and became the landowners through deed.
Well, I tell you, I've certainly learned a lot tonight. I think that at Fountain, I just want to remind everybody that if you want to buy a copy of Ric's book, there it is down in there is a little tab there for you to check it out. And there you go. Or I don't know where your button is.
That's what they do on TV, you know.
Yes, there we go. and so that's we thank you for supporting Ric and supporting Fountain Bookstore. I think when Fountain is at our best, we are hopefully helping people learn a little something in addition to entertaining, and thank you for helping us look really good tonight and really good at our jobs. I'm so happy that this worked out.
And you got a lot of people on the message board.
Yeah, a bunch of people. Wonderful audience tonight, really active, wonderful audience with fantastic questions. So we want to send a special thank you out to them tonight and remind you of our next local history night is going to be, or next Virginia history night will be the last day of September. And we have all kinds of amazing programming going on all the time. But this is I have learned, this has been one of my favorites, Ric. Honestly, thank you for your time. I had such a good time. We do like 3 of these a week, and they're all great. There's always something great for everyone. All kinds of stuff all the time. But I personally feel like I've learned so much tonight, and I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for being such a great guest for our audience.
Oh, thank you as well. I appreciate it. And when you buy the book, go to the footnotes and please go check out the references to make sure you yourself find the same thing that I found. Thank you very much, yes. Kelly, and thank you, audience, as well. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.